It was a Thursday morning in early March when I realized Pietro was gone. My name is Elisa, I'm 28 years old, and I live alone in a modest apartment on Via Carlo Imbonati, northwest of Milan's city center. I had adopted Pietro, a tiny African pygmy hedgehog, a year before. He was my first pet, not counting a lonely goldfish I had in middle school, and we had, quite honestly, become inseparable in our own quiet way. He wasn't cuddly, of course. Hedgehogs aren't lap pets, but he had his own personality. Cautious but curious, often alert in the early hours when I'd come home late from work, and he'd stick his nose out of his enclosure to sniff the air and greet me with tiny squeaks. That Thursday, I'd gotten up like usual at 6:45 a.m. and gone to the kitchen to make coffee. Pietro's enclosure was in the living room, one of those low, wide glass habitats with soft bedding, a heating pad, and plenty of hiding places. I always checked on him first thing. He usually slept buried under his fleece blanket or curled up inside the PVC tunnel he loved. But that morning, he wasn't in the tunnel. The blanket was there, but flat. I remember tilting my head and blinking, still half asleep. I lifted the blanket. Nothing. I checked every corner of the enclosure. I lifted the little wooden house, checked under his exercise wheel. No Pietro. My heart gave a small stutter, but I told myself he must have climbed out somehow. The enclosure didn't have a lid because the walls were high and he'd never once tried to climb them. But maybe I had underestimated him. I started searching the apartment. At first, I called his name softly, Pietro, where are you? Come here, silly boy, though I knew he wouldn't respond. Hedgehogs don't come when called. Still, I hoped he might be curled up behind the couch or under the TV stand. I checked under every piece of furniture. I moved cushions, peeked into shoes, checked the laundry basket. Nothing. The clock ticked past 8 a.m. and panic started to set in. I phoned work and told them I'd be late, maybe not in at all. I needed time. I needed to find him. My apartment wasn't big, 2 rooms and a galley kitchen, but it was filled with places a hedgehog could hide. I moved everything. I pulled books off shelves, appended the laundry bag, even checked the refrigerator and cupboards just in case. I knew it made no sense, but panic isn't rational. By 10:30 a.m., I was shaking. I hadn't cried yet, but I could feel tears pressing behind my eyes. I finally sat down on the floor, legs crossed in the middle of the living room, and stared at the empty enclosure. Then the thought hit me, what if he got out of the apartment? I ran to the front door. It had been closed when I woke up. But I suddenly remembered the night before, around 11:30 p.m., I had taken the trash out. I'd been carrying a full bag, and I'd propped the door open with my foot while locking it behind me. Pietro had never escaped before, so I hadn't thought twice. But what if he'd made a break for it in that exact moment? I opened the door and stared at the hallway. The building was old, with wide landings and metal banisters. If he'd gotten out, where would he have gone? I began knocking on neighbors' doors. The woman across the hall, a retired teacher named Clara, said she hadn't seen anything. A man on the 3rd floor said he'd heard something rustling on the stairs around midnight but figured it was a plastic bag or maybe a cat. I went down all 5 floors of the building, asking everyone I could find. Most were kind. A few seemed confused that I was searching for a hedgehog. One even asked, "Is that legal?" By mid-afternoon, I decided to make flyers. I used a photo I'd taken of Pietro sleeping with his paws tucked under his chin, a small caption, "Lost pet hedgehog. Responds to, Pietro, very small, shy, and harmless. If found, please call," and I listed my number. I printed 60 copies at a small shop around the corner and spent the rest of the afternoon taping them to lampposts, bus stops, and bakery windows. Most people just stared at me curiously. A few asked questions. Some laughed. One boy, maybe 10 or 11, said he'd seen a rat cross via Pellegrino Rossi early that morning, heading toward the corner market. I thanked him and checked the street myself, even crouched down in the gutter to look under a parked van. That night, I hardly slept. I left the door cracked open and sprinkled flour near it to check for tracks. I set out 2 small bowls, one with water, one with crushed mealworms, in the corridor, hoping he might come back. But the bowls stayed untouched. Friday morning came, and then Saturday. Still no sign. I visited animal control and filed a report. I called every local vet and exotic pet clinic I could find. I walked miles every day, retracing my steps, checking under cars, behind dumpsters, around storefronts. I stopped strangers and showed them Pietro's photo. I cried more than I want to admit. On Sunday, I got a call from a woman named Giovanna who owned a children's bookstore near Piazzale Massiachini. She said she hadn't seen Pietro, but she had heard from a friend who owned a bakery a few blocks away that they'd found something strange behind a bag of flour and weren't sure what it was. My heart thumped. I asked for the name of the bakery. Panificio Forno Nuovo, she said. Via Legnoni, number 12. I knew that place. I'd passed it dozens of times. I didn't wait. I threw on shoes, grabbed my keys and phone, and practically ran the 700 meters to the bakery. It was a small, family-run place with a glass counter filled with pastries and fresh bread, and the smell of warm yeast and sugar was almost dizzying. Behind the counter was a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and flour dust on his shirt. I rushed up and said, "Excuse me, I'm looking for a lost hedgehog." "Did someone here find?" Before I could finish, he smiled. "You must be Elisa." I blinked. "Yes, how did you?" My wife talked to Giovanna. She showed me the photo. "Come around." I walked behind the counter, heart in my throat. He led me through a swinging door into the back of the bakery. There were racks of dough, tubs of frosting, and stacks of flour bags against the wall. He gestured toward a small gap between two bags. He was back there. I dropped to my knees. And there, tucked behind a partially torn flour sack, curled into a tight ball, dusted with white powder and twitching slightly at the sound of my voice, was Pietro. I burst into tears. The man smiled kindly and crouched beside me. He was here for almost 2 days. We didn't realize until my son went to move the flour and heard a rustling. At first we thought it was a mouse. Then we saw his little spines. I reached out slowly and touched him. "Pietro," I whispered. He unfurled slightly, sniffed, and made a small clicking noise. My chest ached with relief. I wrapped him gently in my scarf and held him against my chest. "He's yours, no doubt," the man said. I looked up at him. Thank you so much." He smiled. "Next time, tell him to come in through the front door." We both laughed. I left the bakery with Pietro safely tucked into a small canvas bag, held against my stomach. I could feel him shifting inside, probably annoyed, probably hungry. But alive. Found. Back home, I gave him a warm bath, fed him his favorite treat, scrambled egg, and cleaned out his enclosure twice. He sniffed every corner before curling up in the fleece blanket like nothing had happened. I don't know how he made it from my apartment to the bakery, nearly 2 full blocks across multiple streets and sidewalks. Maybe he followed a scent. Maybe instinct took him to a warm place with food smells. After I brought Pietro home from the bakery, everything changed in ways I hadn't expected. That first night, I barely slept, but this time from relief, not worry. I must have checked on him 10 times between midnight and morning. He was calm, if slightly disoriented. His eyes were bright, and his movements a little sluggish from the ordeal, but otherwise he seemed healthy. I kept him warm, hydrated, and gave him extra food. He burrowed back into his blanket with the same stubborn dignity he'd always had, as if nothing unusual had happened. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. How had he survived? How had he made it out of my building, crossed traffic-heavy streets, and navigated through city noise and chaos? Milan isn't exactly hedgehog-friendly terrain. Yet somehow, he had reached that bakery on Via Legnoni, of all places, and curled up behind a flour sack like it was part of his usual nightly routine. It made me look at the city differently. On Monday, I returned to work and told the full story to my colleagues, who had already heard the basics. One of them, Matteo, said that hedgehogs should write a guidebook for lost pets, navigating Milan without a map. We laughed, but the absurdity of the whole thing kept making it hard to believe. I started getting texts from people I barely knew, neighbors, friends of friends. Some said they had seen Pietro's flyer. Others had heard from the bakery. Apparently, the story had already begun circulating. Giovanna from the children's bookstore told the tale to nearly every parent who came in. The baker, whose name I later learned was Franco, told it to his customers with an almost theatrical flair. He even took a photo of Pietro, with my permission, before we left, and stuck a copy of the flyer on his shop window with a handwritten note. "Heroic hedgehog found here, safe and sound." I wasn't looking for attention, but somehow, that's exactly what came. 3 days after Pietro came home, someone from Corriere della Sera, the Milan newspaper, contacted me. They had heard about the story through a chain of local sources and wanted to publish a short human interest piece. At first I hesitated. It felt strange, but they were respectful and kind, and I agreed, thinking it might be nice to share a happy ending for once. The article ran the following Saturday in a small column titled, "Pietro il Riccio, il vagabondo Aspillo, Pietro the Hedgehog, the wandering ball of spines." They used the photo from the flyer, and added a quote from me, "He's small, but brave." I don't know how he did it, but I'm just so glad he came back. After that, things spiraled, gently, but unmistakably. The local pet store offered me a discount on hedgehog supplies. A nearby veterinary clinic reached out and offered to do a complimentary checkup to make sure Pietro had no health issues. The vet, a woman named Lara, was incredibly thorough. She confirmed Pietro was fine, maybe a little dehydrated when he was found, but otherwise healthy and resilient. Even kids in the neighborhood began recognizing him. "E quello il Riccio del giornale?" they'd ask when I carried his travel enclosure on the tram. One morning, a man in his 40s stopped me on the sidewalk and said, "I read about Pietro. My daughter made a drawing of him in school." It was surreal, and strangely beautiful. I was also receiving messages from strangers online, mostly through a neighborhood Facebook group I had joined to post Pietro's missing flyer. Dozens of people had commented, liked, and reshared my posts. After the newspaper story, even more joined in, some sharing similar stories of lost pets, others just wanting to say they were happy Pietro made it home. I think the story resonated with people because it was small and personal, in a world that often feels impersonal and enormous. A tiny creature survives a journey across a big city and ends up in a bakery. That's something simple, tangible, and hopeful. For me, it was more than that. I hadn't realized how lonely I'd been until the experience pulled me into the lives of so many people. I've lived in Milan for years, and like most city dwellers, I moved through it quickly, coffee to metro to work to errands. I nodded at neighbors but didn't really know anyone. Pietro's disappearance, and the search for him, cracked something open. It gave people a reason to talk to each other. To care, even just for a hedgehog. A week after the bakery incident, Clara from across the hall invited me for espresso. We sat on her balcony and she told me about the cat she'd had when she was a girl in Palermo. Franco from the bakery sent me home with free focaccia when I stopped by to thank him again. A student who lived on the 5th floor offered to build a proper lid for Pietro's enclosure, just in case he ever got adventurous again. I accepted. And Pietro? He seemed mostly unbothered by all of it. His daily rhythm resumed like clockwork. He emerged in the early evening, stretched, poked around for food, and curled back up after a few hours of exploration. But I noticed he was more eager to climb things now, like the low walls of his playpen or the edge of the sofa. Maybe he'd always had the urge. Or maybe Milan had awakened it in him. A month later, I wrote a letter to Franco and his family, thanking them properly. I included a small photo of Pietro and a little hedgehog pin I found in a gift shop. Franco sent back a short note, "He's always welcome here. As long as he doesn't eat the pastries." One afternoon in late April, I returned home to find a drawing slid under my apartment door. It was made in crayon, on thick school paper. A child had drawn Pietro, complete with spines, peeking out from behind a loaf of bread. Above him, in red capital letters, it said, "Pietro Euneroe." I pinned it to my wall above his enclosure. In the end, I didn't just get my pet back. I got to see my city in a new way. The streets I'd once rushed through were now filled with faces I recognized. The bakery wasn't just a storefront, but a place where my pet had been saved. My building didn't feel anonymous anymore. It felt like home. I still don't understand how he made it as far as he did. I probably never will. But I do know that Pietro, that stubborn little ball of quills, gave me more than worry and sleepless nights. He gave me a story. He gave me connection. And now, every time I walk past Panificio Forno Nuovo, I smile, because I know that once, for 2 days, my tiny hedgehog made himself at home behind a bag of flour and changed my life in the process.